70 years ago, on October the 1st, 1949, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, stood in Tiananmen Square, pictured here, and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, an outcome of a momentous revolutionary upheaval in the most populous country of the world. It was a monumental event in world history. The Chinese Revolution ended a century of imperialist subjugation and unified a country that had been divided for decades. On the international plane, it dealt a major blow to imperialism, which was desperately seeking to stabilise capitalism after the Second World War had devastated Europe and Asia. The United States, which had emerged as the dominant power, had fought Japan for control over China and its vast investment opportunities, markets, cheap labour and resources. The revolution, however, abruptly ended that prospect. The 1949 revolution also overturned the domination of the landlord class and moneylenders over the countryside and ended much that was socially and culturally backward and oppressive. An agrarian law in 1950 confiscated and redistributed the land of landlords. The 1950 marriage law allowed women to choose their own partners for the first time, ended polygamy, child betrothal, foot binding and concubinage. Prior to 1949, the illiteracy rate in China was 80%, and life expectancy was just 35 years. 30 years later, illiteracy had largely been abolished, and life expectancy had nearly doubled to 65 years. The Chinese Revolution expressed the aspirations of hundreds of millions of workers, peasants, young people, and intellectuals for security and basic democratic and social rights after decades of social upheaval. The Chinese masses had already been through two revolutions, had suffered under the rule of ruthless warlords and the brutal dictatorship of the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Japanese military occupation, first of Manchuria and then of all China. Many youth, workers, peasants had sacrificed, including with their lives, in the struggle against imperialism and its lackeys. In the working class, socialist traditions stemming from the foundation of the Communist Party in 1921 and the subsequent revolutionary upheavals was still strong. In the minds of many, the Chinese Communist Party was linked to the Stalinist regime in Moscow, which claimed, falsely, to be the continuity of the Russian Revolution of 1917, just 3 decades earlier. Yet today, no one can seriously believe that China is socialist or communist. What the regime terms socialism with Chinese characteristics, with its huge private corporations, stock markets, flood of foreign investment, and market pricing of all commodities, including wage labour, is capitalism pure and simple. The Chinese Communist Party has presided over the transformation of the country into a massive cheap labour platform. Astonishing levels of economic growth over the past 3 decades have been accompanied by equally staggering levels of social inequality, the concentration of vast wealth in the hands of a tiny handful of multi-billionaires at the expense of hundreds of millions of workers who struggle to survive each day. The so-called iron rice bowl of social guarantees established after the revolution has been dismantled, leaving working people to fund their own healthcare, education for their children, childcare and other services. With free rein given to the capitalist market, the social evils that were largely abolished by the revolution, drug abuse, prostitution and slave labour, to name but a few, have returned. To understand how and why this happened, in other words, the restoration of capitalism, it is necessary to examine the historic roots of contemporary China in the revolution 70 years ago. We study history not as an academic exercise, although that has its own legitimacy, but in order to draw the necessary political and theoretical lessons for the struggles today. Anyone wanting to fight for socialism must necessarily be able to explain why Stalinism and Maoism, that claim to represent socialism, resulted in capitalist restoration. To understand that, it is necessary to examine in some detail the complex political and theoretical issues raised by the Chinese Revolution 70 years ago. The Chinese Revolution was itself the product of the defining event of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution, that had created the first workers' state just 32 years earlier. In the midst of the ravages of World War I, the revolutionary events in Russia, and the seizure of power by the Bolshevik Party led by Lenin and Trotsky, stood out like a beacon to the working class around the world. It generated revolutionary movements against capitalism and colonial oppression, and a commitment to socialism and socialist revolution in layers of the working class internationally. That was expressed in the founding of communist parties and the Third International in 1919. It's important to understand the theoretical underpinning of the Russian Revolution, which was the outcome of intense debate in the decade after the 1905 Russian Revolution. Three very different and opposed conceptions emerged. The Mensheviks, one of the major factions in the Russian Social Democratic Party, were the proponents of a two-stage theory. They argued that the working class first had to support liberal elements of the capitalist class to overthrow the Tsar, establish a democratic republic, and carry out land reform. And then, only much later, was the fight for socialism possible. But as the 1905 revolution had demonstrated, the Russian liberals, known as the Cadets, when faced with an upsurge of the working class, swung rapidly behind the old Tsarist regime. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the second major faction, rejected the subordination of the working class to the liberals and called for a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. But this implied that the working class would be compelled to confine itself to the limitations of a bourgeois, that is, a capitalist republic. Moreover, the exact relationship between the workers and peasants, who comprised two distinct classes, was left open. The third conception was the theory of permanent revolution, championed by Leon Trotsky. He, like Lenin, opposed any subordination of workers to the capitalist class, insisting that the working class had to fight directly for power, drawing behind it the peasantry, which, he pointed out, could play no politically independent role. Against those who ridiculed the idea that a workers' state could survive in a backward country with a huge peasantry, Trotsky explained that in the backward countries, that is, those with a belated capitalist development, such as Russia and China, the bourgeoisie was incapable of carrying through the democratic revolution. That task fell to the working class. He insisted that the Russian Revolution was an integral part of the world socialist revolution, and that the problems thrown up by the revolution in Russia could only be resolved through the struggle for socialism internationally. In April 1917, as the Russian Revolution was unfolding, Lenin embraced Trotsky's perspective and issued a call for all power to the Soviets, that is, to the democratically established workers' councils that developed in 1917. In other words, he called for the working class to take power. He and Trotsky characterised the Bolshevik seizure of power in October of that year as the opening shot of the world socialist revolution in the new epoch of imperialism that was opened up by World War I. However, under conditions of defeats of the revolutionary movements in Europe and the consequent isolation of the Soviet Union, Stalin was to emerge as the representative of a privileged conservative bureaucracy that usurped power from the working class. Its outlook was summed up in the nationalist conception of socialism in one country that rejected the perspective on which the Bolshevik Revolution had been based and was to have profound consequences for the working class internationally, not least in China. Our movement, the International Trotskyist Movement, was established in 1923 to fight against the Stalinist degeneration of the Soviet Union and uphold the struggle for socialist internationalism. A brief review of these theoretical issues, which I've just elaborated, is essential to understanding of the revolution in China, or should I say, the three revolutions in China. The first Chinese revolution overthrew the decrepit Manchu dynasty in 1911, but the capitalist Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, that emerged proved utterly incapable of implementing basic democratic tasks or freeing China from imperialist subjugation. The second Chinese Revolution, between 1925 and 27, erupted as a working-class struggle against the depredations of imperialism after the shooting of protesters in Shanghai by British municipal police on May the 30th, 1925. It rapidly transformed into a mass movement throughout the country. But the role of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union was to have fatal consequences. Stalin subordinated the Chinese Communist Party, which had only been established in 1921, to the party of the Chinese capitalist class, the Kuomintang. Reverting to the Menshevik two-stage theory, Stalin insisted that the bourgeoisie could be compelled to fight against imperialist oppression and play a progressive role as part of a bloc of four classes that would end China's semi-colonial subjugation. This is a long quote from Leon Trotsky, but this was written at the high point of the revolution, or really the climax of the revolution in 1927. And answering Stalin, he says the following: "It is a gross mistake to think that imperialism mechanically welds together all the classes of China from without. The revolutionary struggle against imperialism does not weaken, but rather strengthens the political differentiation of the classes. Imperialism is a highly powerful force in the internal relationships of China. The struggle against imperialism, precisely because of its economic and military power, demands a powerful exertion of forces from the very depths of the Chinese people. To really arouse the workers and peasants against imperialism, it is possible only by connecting their basic and most profound life interests with the cause of the country's liberation. But everything that brings the oppressed and exploited masses of the toilers to their feet inevitably pushes the national bourgeoisie into an open bloc with the imperialists. This class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the masses of workers and peasants is not weakened, but on the contrary, is sharpened by imperialist oppression to the point of bloody civil war at every serious conflict." That last point is extremely important. Stalin continued to promote the fatal illusion that Chiang Kai-shek represented a revolutionary wing of the Chinese bourgeoisie. In doing so, he became the gravedigger of the revolution, facilitating the massacre of the Shanghai working class in April 1927 by Chiang Kai-shek and his armies, and the subsequent slaughter of workers and peasants by the so-called left Kuomintang in May 1927. This is what was happening in Shanghai. Some 5,000 workers who had seized control of the city, communists and others, were slaughtered by Chiang Kai-shek's troops and various underground gangsters with whom he had connections. After this, and after another massacre in May, Stalin then carried out an abrupt about-face and, amid the waning revolutionary tide, flung the battered Chinese Communist Party into a series of disastrous adventures. The consequences of these defeats were to lead to the defamation of the Third Chinese Revolution 2 decades later in 1949. Those leaders and members of the Chinese Communist Party committed to the principles of socialist internationalism, such as the party's chairman, Chen Duxiu, and Central Committee member, Peng Shuzi, who had opposed Stalin's policies and were convinced by Trotsky's critique, were expelled from the party. And others, whatever their tactical disagreements with Stalin, such as Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai and others, followed the Menshevik line dictated from Moscow. Despite the disasters of 1927, Stalin and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party insisted that no mistakes had been made and continued to adhere to the policies of class collaboration, the two-stage theory and the block of four classes. Moreover, after the crushing blows delivered by the Kuomintang, the Chinese Communist Party retreated to the countryside, thus shifting its class axis from the working class to the peasantry. This was to undermine, weaken and endanger the post-World War II revolutionary movement in China and elsewhere. Following the end of World War II and the defeat of Germany and Japan in 1945, US imperialism, now the dominant global power, relied on the betrayals of Stalinism to contain and suppress the post-war upheavals of the working class and oppressed masses around the world. Having subordinated the working class to the so-called democratic allies, above all the United States, during the war, Stalin continued the same policy after the war. In countries like France and Italy, the communist parties formed coalition governments with the discredited capitalist parties, disarmed the working class, and suppressed major strike movements of workers. Having stabilised capitalist rule in Europe, the United States went on the counter-offensive against the Soviet Union in 1947-48, which marked the onset of the Cold War. Mao and the Chinese Communist Party followed the policy dictated by Stalin. In 1937, the CCP had entered an alliance with the Kuomintang to fight the Japanese invasion. This was a repeat of the politically bankrupt policy that had led to the disasters just a decade earlier. Mao politically subordinated the party to Chiang Kai-shek, the butcher of Shanghai, dropped its land reform so as not to upset the landowners represented by the KMT, and put its armies under Chiang's command. Following the defeat of Japan, under pressure from Moscow and Washington, the CCP sought to form a coalition government with Chiang Kai-shek. Mao, after he'd flown to Chongqing to meet up with Chiang Kai-shek, he was accompanied by the US ambassador at the time. He held 7 weeks of discussions and issued a joint statement with the butcher of Shanghai on the formation of a coalition government. While Mao later dismissed the agreement as a mere scrap of paper, he did everything possible to conciliate with the Chinese bourgeoisie. His program of new democracy was a revival of the two-stage theory, which he used to justify alliances with the capitalists. To facilitate these, the Communist Party limited its land reform to areas under its control and, above all, opposed any mobilisation of the working class. In doing so, it acted as a dangerous brake on the revolutionary movement of the masses that followed the end of the war in China. The Third Chinese Revolution, involved far more than just the victory of Mao's armies over Chiang Kai-shek. After the end of World War II, the whole of Chinese society was in revolt, including in the cities. In a striking confirmation of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, the Kuomintang, which took over from the defeated Japanese troops, proved utterly incapable of carrying out elementary democratic reforms or ending the social disaster facing the population. The regime presided over the looting of businesses and public property, triggered hyperinflation, imposed military conscription, and responded to strikes and protests with savage repression. In his report to the Fourth International in 1951, Chinese Trotskyist Peng Shu-tse explained the following. The first period, immediately after the war, from September 1945 to the end of 1946, marked a considerable revival and growth of the mass movement in China. In this period, the working masses in all the great cities, with Shanghai in the forefront, Shanghai being the major industrial city, first brought forward their demands for a sliding scale increase in wages, for the right to organise trade unions, against freezing wages, etc. They universally and continuously engaged in strikes. Undoubtedly, this was an expression of a new awakening of the Chinese workers' movement. In Shanghai alone, China's main industrial centre, there were 1,716 strikes and labour disputes in the year 1946, as compared to just 278 a decade earlier in 1936, just prior to the Japanese invasion. The following year, the figure was up 50% higher again. At the same time, student strikes and protests were taking place in major cities against the Kuomintang dictatorship and demanding democracy and peace. This was taking place alongside rising unrest among the peasants. Yet the Communist Party made no attempt to mobilise the working class and continued to seek a coalition with the corrupt and despised Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek exploited the hiatus to transport his army with US assistance to the cities, consolidate his position, and start offensive military operations against the Communist Party. But Mao continued to remain on the defensive. He issued no call for Chiang's overthrow, even after KMT troops occupied the communist stronghold of Yan'an in April 1947, and even after it issued a warrant for Mao's arrest in June 1947. It was only on October the 10th, 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, that the Communist Party finally issued a manifesto to oust the Kuomintang and to build a new China. The fact that Mao's army seized most of China within just 2 years testifies to the inner rot of the Chiang Kai-shek regime, which literally fell apart despite the modern arms and assistance that it received from the United States. With the help of Japanese arms provided to its forces in Manchuria by the Soviet Union, the People's Liberation Army swept south. In many cases, the Kuomintang armies surrendered or fled, and cities were taken without any fighting. As the regime disintegrated, the US deserted Chiang Kai-shek because the only alternative was a full-scale American military intervention that risked a wider war and for which they were totally unprepared. The speed of its collapse demonstrated that the Kuomintang could have been toppled far earlier if Mao had not held back the revolutionary movement, particularly of the working class in the cities. Summing up these processes, the American Trotskyists of the Socialist Workers' Party wrote in a 1955 resolution on the Chinese Revolution the following: "The Stalinist defamation of the revolution rendered its development more costly, convulsive and protracted. The armies and regime of Chiang could have been knocked down like rotten pieces of wood had the CCP at any time summoned the masses in the cities to rise. The Chinese Stalinists were able to ride to power because the Chinese working class had been demoralised by the continuous defeats it suffered during and after the Second Chinese Revolution. And the deliberate policy of the CCP, which subordinated the cities above all the proletariat to the military struggle in the countryside, and thereby blocked the emergence of the workers as an independent political force. Mao's new democracy program not only retarded and endangered the revolution, but deformed the new regime. In line with the two-stage theory, the Communist Party sought alliances with bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, and, with the exception of property left behind by the fleeing Kuomintang forces, did not take over private enterprises, even foreign-owned ones. 11 of the 24 government ministries and 3 of the 6 vice-chairmen were headed by the CP's bourgeois allies. In an effort to reach out to imperialism, Mao made no move to take over the colonial enclaves of Hong Kong and Macau. Mao had to rein in his own members who were being pressured by workers to improve their conditions. In an editorial in Xinhua in February 1948, he announced an anti-leftist campaign that required workers, but not private owners, to subordinate themselves to the war effort. It complained that party cadres, including in high positions, did not understand the party's industrial policy and, quote, only know about the one-sided, narrow, nearsighted so-called benefits for the workers and cannot see anything beyond that. The Communist Party recruited workers as members and established trade unions, not to give the working class a political voice, but as a means of policing and suppressing it. When strikes and protests broke out, it resorted to violent repression. The Russian Revolution of 1917 remains to date the only genuine socialist revolution, in which the working class, guided by Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik Party, seized power and established a worker state based on Soviets, that is, democratically elected organs of the working class. In China, there were no such workers' organisations because the CCP had instructed workers to passively await their liberation by its armies. In opposition to everything written on the necessity of abolishing the capitalist state by Marx, Engels, Lenin and Trotsky, the Communist Party based itself on the existing state apparatus. As it took over the cities, the Stalinists kept the civilian bureaucracy in place and incorporated defeated Kuomintang armies, including officers, into its own military. Mao's projection that the revolution's so-called democratic stage, in alliance with sections of the bourgeoisie, would last many, many years. But in less than a year, it faced the threat of military attack by US imperialism, which launched the Korean War in 1950. As the war proceeded and China was compelled to intervene, these are Chinese troops crossing over the Yalu River into North Korea from the beginning of October 1950. The US general in charge of military operations in Korea was so confident that he declared, we will wipe out the Chinese army in 3 weeks. The war itself only finished 3 years later. As the war proceeded and China was compelled to intervene, it faced internal sabotage from layers of the capitalist class that regarded the US-led armies in Korea as their potential liberators. The Maoist regime, facing a possible US invasion, was compelled to rapidly make inroads into private enterprise and to institute bureaucratic Soviet-style economic planning. Mao's government took over foreign enterprises such as the American-owned Asia Oil Company in China and nationalised major sections of the economy. In 1953, some 4 years after the revolution had taken place, It implemented the first 5-year plan, closely modelled on Soviet bureaucratic planning and with the assistance of Soviet aid and advisors. The Chinese economy was closely tied to that of the Soviet bloc. Nonetheless, neither Stalin nor Mao ever proposed the unification of their two states in a common Soviet Union of socialist republics. Neither proceeded on the basis of the internationalist interests of the working class, but rather on the narrow nationalist interests of the privileged bureaucracies that they represented. In its 1955 resolution, the Socialist Workers' Party characterised China as a deformed workers' state. The nationalisation of industry and the banks, along with bureaucratic economic planning, had laid the foundations for a workers' state, but it was deformed from birth by Stalinism. The Fourth International, our movement, unconditionally defended the nationalised property relations established in China. At the same time, however, it recognised the bureaucratically deformed origins of the Maoist regime as its dominant feature, making its overthrow through political revolution the only way forward for the construction of socialism in China as an integral part of the struggle for socialism internationally. It's not possible, in the space of a relatively brief lecture, to review in detail the evolution of the Chinese regime from a deformed workers' state to the second largest capitalist economy in the world, but I will make a few points. Leon Trotsky warned in the 1930s that without a political revolution of the working class, capitalist restoration was inevitable in the Soviet Union. That prognosis applied just as accurately to China, as well as the Stalinist states in Eastern Europe. While the economic steps taken by Mao initially led to a revival of the war-ravaged economy, its autarkic perspective of socialism in one country inevitably led to worsening economic and social turmoil and crises for which the Beijing had no solution. The result was bitter internal factional warfare and abrupt twists and turns. Mao's utopian scheme for a self-sufficient socialist society underpinned his Great Leap Forward in 1958, which ended in economic catastrophe and mass starvation. His factional opponents, led by Liu Shaoxi, followed the Soviet model of bureaucratic planning, but this provided no alternative. The economic crisis was greatly worsened by the 1961-63 split with the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of Soviet aid and advisors, leaving China completely isolated. Various neo-Maoist tendencies in China today falsely seek to portray Mao as a genuine socialist and Marxist revolutionary, whose ideas were betrayed by others. Their claims rely heavily on Mao's so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, which was neither great, proletarian, nor revolutionary. In reality, Mao's Cultural Revolution was a last desperate bid to oust his rivals, whom he branded as capitalist roaders. Mao sought to mobilise support outside the party amongst student youth and then amongst the lumpen proletariat and poor peasants, organised in the so-called Red Guards. The reactionary character of this movement was expressed in its encouragement of peasant individualism, the denunciation of all culture and science as bourgeois, and its elevation of the political doggerel in Mao's Little Red Book to the status of an official state religion. This initiative rapidly spun out of control, leading to confused and convulsive social struggles that threatened the very existence of the regime. When workers in Shanghai took Mao's edict, bombarded the headquarters literally, and engaged in mass strikes, forming the independent Shanghai People's Commune in 1967, Mao brought in the military to bring the turmoil under control. The hostility of the regime to the working class was expressed in its warning to Shanghai workers, which I've quoted here. As workers, this was from one of the leaders of the Cultural Revolution, as workers, their main job is to work. Joining the revolution is only secondary. Therefore, these workers pictured here must go back to work and end this struggle. In reality, it was Mao himself who opened the road to capitalist restoration. Facing mounting economic and social problems and the threat of war with the Soviet Union, Beijing forged an alliance with US imperialism that laid the base for China's integration into global capitalism. While Deng Xiaoping is credited with initiating market reforms, Mao's rapprochement with US President Richard Nixon in 1972 was the essential precondition for foreign investment and increased trade with the West. In foreign policy, the Maoist regime lined up with some of the most reactionary US-based dictatorships in the world, including those of General Augusto Pinochet in Chile and the Shah in Iran. At home, Mao rehabilitated Deng Xiaoping, who had been ostracised during the Cultural Revolution as the number 2 capitalist roader. After Mao's death, Deng emerged as the dominant figure in the Stalinist bureaucracy and in 1978 initiated his sweeping reform and opening agenda of special economic zones for foreign investors, private enterprise instead of communes in the countryside, and the replacement of economic planning with the market. The result was a vast expansion of private enterprises, especially in the countryside, the rapid rise of social inequality, looting and corruption by party bureaucrats, growing joblessness and soaring inflation. It was this social powder keg that exploded in 1989, triggered by student protests in Tiananmen Square over democratic rights. This was not simply a movement of students in Beijing, but developed into a revolt by the working class throughout the country against the impact of Deng's pro-market policies. Its violent suppression paved the way for wholesale capitalist restoration, similar to the processes that were underway in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The International Committee of the Fourth International, our movement, was alone in explaining that the collapse or transformation of these regimes was not due to the failure of socialism, but was the product of Stalinism and its bankrupt nationalist perspective of socialism in one country. Moreover, we demonstrated that the globalisation of production, which had greatly accelerated these processes, was also undermining all parties and institutions based on national economic regulation, and that included the Labor Party and the trade unions here. I'll conclude with several points about China today. Firstly, the emergence of China as the industrial giant that it is today, the world's second largest economy, does not represent a new flourishing of capitalism, nor is it really the product of any inherent strength of the Chinese economy. Rather, the staggering rates of growth in China are the result of the plundering of its vast reserves of cheap labour by global capital, as it seeks to overcome falling rates of profit. The foreign investment that flooded into China after the Tiananmen Square massacre was facilitated by what remained of the achievements of the 1949 revolution: the establishment of infrastructure, basic industry, and particularly an educated workforce. The brutal suppression of the protests offered a guarantee to foreign investors that the regime would not hesitate to use police-state repression against future working-class unrest. The economic rise of China, however, has brought it face-to-face with the global order dominated by US imperialism. The US and other imperialist powers were eager to benefit from the super profits generated by cheap Chinese labour as long as it didn't challenge their own domination Nevertheless, China's need for huge supplies of energy, raw materials and markets, as well as its moves into high-tech areas, is cutting across the economic and geopolitical interests of imperialism, particularly US imperialism. In a bid to maintain its weakening global dominance, the US, firstly under Obama's pivot to Asia and now under Trump, has aggressively sought to undermine and confront China across the board, diplomatically, economically, and also militarily. Washington has recklessly inflamed flashpoints such as the South China Sea, built up its military forces across the Asia-Pacific, and strengthened alliances, including with Australia, in preparation for war. This aggressive build-up has been accompanied by an escalating propaganda campaign, including, or one could say particularly in Australia, denouncing Chinese expansionism and Chinese political interference in order to condition public opinion and as a pretext for anti-democratic measures such as the foreign interference legislation passed here last year. An atmosphere of anti-Chinese xenophobia is being whipped up that casts suspicion over Chinese students and the Chinese community as a whole. Taken together, this is the ideological preparation for war. Pseudo-left organisations, such as Socialist Alternative, have become mouthpieces for this campaign by branding China as an imperialist power, a characterisation that ignores the historical origins of the People's Republic of China and is used to justify their backing for US imperialism. While the Chinese ruling elites have ambitions for China to become a major world power, it is not part of the global imperialist order established over the past century and dominated today by the United States. The IYSE and the Socialist Equality Party oppose the US-led war drive, but we extend no political support whatsoever to the Stalinist regime in Beijing, which has no progressive answer to Washington's provocations and military build-up. The Communist Party is organically incapable of making any appeal to the only social force capable of preventing war, the working class in China and around the world. The Stalinist regime is far more terrified of a mass movement of workers than it is of the threat of imperialism. And that is why it spends more on its internal police state apparatus than it does on its military. It seeks to create a social base for itself, particularly amongst middle-class layers, by whipping up Chinese nationalism, whose only purpose is to divide both the Chinese and international working class. It is certainly true that China's rapid economic growth has lifted the living standards of significant sections of the population. According to the World Bank, the percentage of the population living under the austere poverty line of $1.90 US a day has fallen from 88% in 1981 to 0.7% in 2015. However, social inequality has reached staggering levels. From one of the most socially equal countries in the world, it has become one of the most socially unequal. The Communist Party does not represent the interests of workers or the peasant masses, but the cliques of ultra-rich oligarchs who built their fortunes through the looting of state-owned property and the gross exploitation of the working class. The combined net worth of the 5 richest individuals pictured here topped $155 billion this year, while workers struggle to survive on a minimum wage of $370 a month. That's if they're paid at all. Amid a resurgence of the class struggle internationally, as witnessed by the current 48,000-strong auto workers' strike in the United States and the many thousands engaged in the Yellow Vest movement in France, there is every reason to believe, or to expect, explosive struggles of the Chinese working class, which has expanded massively to an estimated 400 million workers. Official statistics are no longer released of the so-called mass incidents, but there are indications of rising levels of strikes, many over the non-payment of wages and benefits, such as the 2014 strike of footwear workers. The protracted mass protests in Hong Kong involving millions over basic democratic rights are a symptom of far deeper social tensions, not only in that territory, but throughout China. The confused and heterogeneous character of the Hong Kong protests underscores the fundamental problem confronting the working class, the lack of revolutionary leadership. That is what has to be built throughout China, and one could say internationally. In the absence of a revolutionary party, the upheaval in Hong Kong can take very right-wing directions, such as the appeals that we have seen to the United States and Britain, who have no interest whatsoever in the democratic rights in Hong Kong. Only a turn to the Chinese and international working class on the basis of a socialist perspective can democratic rights be achieved. Our political perspective is based on the principles of revolutionary socialist internationalism that animated the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the formation of communist parties around the world, including in China, and that were betrayed by Stalinism. The historic lessons of those protracted struggles waged by the Trotskyist movement must form the basis of the expansion of sections of the International Committee of the Fourth International and the establishment of new sections, including especially in China. So in conclusion, or the conclusion from this lecture, is that everyone here must seriously consider playing your part in this historic task. If you're not currently reading the World Socialist website, I would encourage you to begin. And if you're not a member of the IYSSE or Socialist Equality Party, I urge you to apply to join and to help build the necessary revolutionary leadership for the struggles that will arise ahead. Thank you very much.